the room, please turn your headphones on. Excellent work. Now, today we're going to be talking about why businesses need to be better public advocates on climate change. And when we say better advocates, we obviously mean that in an ethical point of view, not they're better at lobbying us. Today we have some really interesting people joining us from 3 other organizations who have very similar scope to WWF's. They are Rebecca Kershaw, Global Net Zero Program Lead at the Climate Champions, Dominic Gogol, Deputy Policy Director at We Mean Business, and Viola Meyer-Weisflog, Program Manager at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And me, I am Sean Mallon. I'm a Global Initiative Lead for WWF's Climate Business Network. And because this is my session, I'm going to do a quick rundown of what we do. The Climate Business Network is a group of 34 of the largest companies on this planet working to limit their impacts from climate change. They're working with us to help decarbonize their entire strategy and work towards a positive net zero, all the good stuff that we want to see. That work we do with these companies is defined through our corporate blueprint. We call this Beyond Net Zero. So this is our leadership vision. We've developed this in partnership with our partners, but we also look to kind of synthesize all the other reports out there. So we've looked at everything that's out in this stratosphere and bring it into one single report. This is an evergreen report. We constantly update this with new versions and new updates to language to make sure it's still relevant. And we've laid it all out in 7 key steps. So no matter what a business is asked to do, it'll fit into this roadmap. So they start with accounting, disclosing, set reduction targets, actually reduce. That's something that often gets overlooked sometimes. Financing change, engaging with policy, collaborating with peers, and enabling and inspiring their customers. In today's session, we're going to be focusing in on the 5th point on that, which is engaging responsibly and actively in climate policy in line with 1.5 degrees and ensuring internal and external alignment in that policy. So, that's where we are. People can feel free to scan to take this down. But before we get into the conversation, I just wanted to set some context as well, because we haven't had any doom and gloom in about 20 minutes. So let's just say it. We are at the threshold for 1.5 degree pathway, which will unlock devastating climate-changing impacts on our ecosystem. The Living Planet report that was just launched has detailed that we are losing and have lost 73% of invertebrate and wildlife populations since 1970. And with our current policies that are in place, the world is on track to hit a 2.7 degree heating pathway this century. And we all know our governments are always very effective at hitting their targets and doing what they've promised to do. And while we're here talking about this, we are joined by 123 oil company CEOs, all holding host country badges. And there are 1,773 coal, oil, and gas lobbyists in attendance. The OPEC pavilion's just around the corner. So that's who we're fighting. That's what we're fighting for. And where are the businesses that we work with? Those amazing businesses I showed you earlier on? Well, a lot of them didn't show up this week. There's been an awful narrative that began with COP a few weeks before it even began, that many people have declared it a failure because it's not interesting to them. And when some businesses said they weren't going to go, others said, well, then it's not relevant for us, and became a vicious cycle that's kind of dominated our news stream. Obviously, they've completely forgotten about all the world leaders and all the policy engagement and all the actual reasons we convene a COP. But, you know, this is part of the conversation. I think that's relevant to our work as well as 4 groups who convene businesses. I think it's a tough note for ourselves to start the session, but something we need to do. Now, I'm going to flip back to our speakers, and I'm going to start off. Clearly, I'm in such a great mood about this. I'm feeling it. I am a bit jaded about this, and I would like to say WWF's position is we do invite and want inclusive COPs. We want everything. But for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to step away from that position, and I'm going to say, let's kick these guys out. It is your 3 jobs to this to convince me back, to give me hope. So that's my first question to all of you. Should we remove business attendance and just let them work through groups like ours? Do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, a bleak start, but yeah, as you said, a good reality check, right? And I very much resonate with your point that everyone said, not everyone, but a lot of people said, oh, well, if there's going to be fewer CEOs attending COP, it's been a failure. And any narrative that says that showing up to a COP is the only way to demonstrate climate leadership and action is just clearly wrong. But why should we have businesses actually showing up at COP? Well, so the high-level climate champions' entire role is to bring and sort of coordinate what's called the action agenda. And the point of that is really to say you can have a political process. You obviously need that. You need the sort of multilateral piece to work. But at the end of the day, you need people to actually do it. And on the ground, those who we've heard again and again here, those who have the money, have capacity of innovation, jobs, etc. Those are the private sector. And so while it is very important organizations like ours that represent the private sector in these processes, there is just something about having people on the ground, having C-suite leaders, but also technical leaders, having heads of procurement and research and finance teams come and say, look, I've gone this far. I've done this. I've put my money I've set an ambitious goal. I've put my money where my mouth is on this, but I've only got so far because there are policy and regulatory structures that prevent me from going further. And while I dearly love everyone on this panel, but we cannot represent every single sector, every country, everything and every problem. And the reality is hearing directly from the mouth of business is just very powerful in these processes. But I do very much agree that from my perspective, I think we need a sort of bar to entry on here that is not about about how much you're willing and able to pay for access. There needs to be a rethinking around who actually gets to show up at these COPs from a private sector perspective. And so while our organizations are sort of platforming those who are ambitious and are leading, and there are spaces for that, I do acknowledge that that's not the case across the board. So there's maybe some work to be done around that one.
Pretty good answer. Not going to lie. Do you guys want to feed in on that?
To add to the points that Rebecca shared, that I really agree. I think if you go back to the Copenhagen COP, which failed in 2009, and that ultimately failed because the private sector weren't willing and able to stand up and support governments to set ambitious targets. They hadn't bottomed out what the transition would look like for themselves, both as companies, but also sectors, and how the investors would fund it. And then if you fast forward 6 years later to the Paris COP, by then the Science-Based Target Initiative had been launched. Companies were beginning to set science-based targets, and they were beginning to work out how they would decarbonize their own operations, and therefore they were able to support governments in signing up to the Paris Agreement. And since then, actions from the private sector have only grown in exponential scale. We're now at over 8,000 companies have set science-based target. Hundreds of companies have set 100% renewables targets, or they've committed to electrify their fleets. So the actions that companies are taking have a real impact on the negotiations. And the role that we as business groups play with companies is how we mobilize private sector voices to get to the ears of ministers and negotiators. So when they're at the negotiation table, like at this COP on the NCQG or on important actions on mitigation, they hear from real economy actors on the actions they're taking and how that can enable good, ambitious policies here and at national capitals, can enable more companies to act and to decarbonize. So I think it's very important that companies do turn up to COP consistently, but I agree with Rebecca. I think there are ways that we can improve standards and best practice for how companies, and particularly for how trade groups, engage with the UNFCCC process. Next year we're going to launch a new piece of work on that, looking at how we can kind of flag best practice. Viola?
Yeah, thank you. I guess, so I represent the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and something that our institute stands for is systems, like whole systems change. So we do believe that, it can't just be a government that leads on this. It needs to be every single sector and every single aspect of society. So we're looking at, people, nature, climate from a very holistic point of view. The corporate leaders groups that I lead the chapter on in the UK, for example, is this very high level and high denominator business leadership group that I guess operates on what we call an ambition loop. So it's I totally agree with what Dom just said, but essentially what we're trying to push is by showcasing business leadership and also enabling them to like become more ambitious and set that safe space for them to become more ambitious, we are essentially pushing government to do more and in a way provide them, I don't want to say cover, but like in a way we're giving them the reasoning when they talk to their populations back home, like we're doing this is a positive business case, will create jobs, like we're safe doing this, so that's where we're coming from essentially.
Okay, pretty good answers, I guess. You're kind of winning me back around slowly. But just touching on what you kind of said there, how do we bring these businesses along and help them engage more meaningfully? What can that look like in practice? And I guess this maybe teases up for a question. What did you guys do at COP this year to kind of engage with them as well?
I feel bad because I keep going fast, but how can we get them to engage more meaningfully? I see there's kind of three obvious levels at which businesses are engaging. One is directly. I mean, realistically, large businesses have corporate affairs teams. They have, a whole kind of mechanism behind this, and it's not always about climate. It's often not about climate. So how are we making sure that that around the globe consistently that is happening in a way that is in line with the climate goals they've set and with the sort of the Paris-aligned ambition that we all want to be seeing, right? And that, having done that within a business, there's a huge lift there in terms of capacity building, skills and awareness within the organization to be able to do that. And I don't personally believe that is, COP is not necessarily the place to do that. That is happening behind the scenes at national level. So that's something that I think there's certain actors that have a huge vested interest in continuing the way that economies work right now that are very well funded to do this. And so we need companies to step up that are ambitious to be more vocal at that level, particularly now as we're talking about NDCs, the sort of national level plans, to be really concrete about, look, these are the hurdles where you need government to get out the way so that the economics that now make infinite sense on the energy transition can sort of take us along, and other kind of specifics there. But then there's sort of as was already mentioned by Dominic, the huge role of trade associations. The vast majority of businesses are not individually going and lobbying governments in 200 odd countries around this transition. They are implicitly doing it through the position of the membership bodies that they are part of. And so so getting more transparency, and we've seen Unilever really going out ahead on this one, and doing that sort of inventorization of what are they sort of accidentally lobbying through their associations that are not in line with their goals, right? And if we can even activate that middle that are not active on climate to be lobbying for more positive climate policy, then we could get a long way there. And then the third is you'll see the sort of statement letters, sign-ons, the sort of high-level pieces that are often coming out at COPs to really call on governments, and that's where as a collective voice, kind of publicly, the private sector can say this is kind of what we're moving into. But in terms of and I will be quick, the question you're asking about this year, what I've been working on, among other things, is around the voice of small and medium enterprise. Because we come to COP, and honestly, the only people who are here are large multinationals, and as 50% of GDP or more in some countries, and 70% of employment, if we're talking about just transition, if we're talking about skills that are actually going to bridge between climate commitments and climate action, these are the kinds of businesses that we really need to be bringing along. And they don't speak the language of COP. They don't speak the language of climate policy, but they do speak the language of jobs, of communities, right? So I think that's a piece that we really need to bring in more into this space as we move along.
So in terms of how companies should engage with the COP process and what we see would be best practice, I think companies need to engage in a lot more depth when it comes to policy advocacy. It is important and helpful that companies put out position statements saying we support the Paris Agreement. That's great, but that's quite 2016. We want companies to go a lot more in depth. Now, what are the specific policies that will enable a company to transition? Most companies are now bottoming out their science-based targets. They're creating transition action plans. Within that, there'll be key policies that will enable a company, whether it's a heavy industry company, whether it's a car manufacturer, whether it's a power company, to decarbonize. And through that, that's pretty clear. These are your policy priorities that you should be working at, both at national level or state level, depending on where your operations are, but also here at COP. So I think depth of policy engagement from companies is now really needed. I'd also say consistency. This isn't something that just the CSO needs to have talking point for now. This is something which needs to have board sign-off. It's something that regulatory affairs, public affairs, and your lobbyists that you work for, you all need to be in lockstep with your policy position. And frankly, that's what to be expected. These companies are very professional organizations. We hold them to a high standard, and therefore we'd expect them to be consistent advocates, and that one side of an organization, of an operation, is the same as it is in a different country. So I think depth and I think consistency, and then you'd really start seeing more of an impact, that ministers and policymakers would be getting that message loud and clear, and that would have an impact here at COP29, but it would also have an impact next year in particular when we move into the crucial phase of engaging governments on their NDCs.
I guess to build on that as well, so in terms of like how we show up to COP or how our businesses show up to COP, so something that we've really tried to work hard on this year is to get the Corporate Leaders Group UK being a sponsor of the UK Pavilion this time around, which is a first for us. So, we really tried to bring home the case to our companies that it is really important to show up despite this kind of negative narrative that was very much promoted ahead of it. And, for us it was important that businesses, so we created this campaign on the UK NDC and, kind of feeding off the Women Business global campaign for ambitious and investable NDCs. And so we kind of pushed that on a national level and had essentially starting from the summer up to COP, a big letter campaign and a big sign-on campaign, and tried to really make the case for showing up. And I'm glad to say that 3 of our members individually sponsored the COP, the UK Pavilion, and then obviously CLG UK, which presents or like represents a much wider group and a cross-sector group, including SMEs. We're able to do that as well, and to essentially push that ambition and give the UK that confidence, I guess, maybe that it needed at the beginning to launch their ambitious 81% in NDC.
Okay, I've got one for Rebecca here. What are the most impactful ways companies can engage in policy?
The most impactful, well, that's how long is a piece of string? I think it depends. It depends on the business, right? Like Dominic said it well in terms of being really specific. Okay, because every it's not even just sector. It's where you are in value chains, and we often think about things as sort of specific industries or sector, but sometimes it's even worth thinking about it in terms of sourcing, right? If you're talking about specific policies that will or regulatory barriers, but if you're a small business, I think the most impactful way you can do it is exactly, as you said, be part of something bigger, where if you don't have the resource, make sure that your voice is heard through something bigger that has the resource and the maturity to do this for you. And where you do have, if you're in the very fortunate position as a business to, be able to pick up a phone to a minister, I don't want to advocate doing that broadly, because I think it's a bit of a challenging situation globally, but where there are certain moments, for example, now as we go into the G20, making sure that there is an understanding by governments that the private sector is ready, comes with an offer and not just an ask, an offer of solutions and investment, and then the ask is often much more effective than just going in sort of bashing and complaining that things aren't the way that you want them to be. So I think, come with the offer with the ask would be usually my the most effective way.
One quick addition on that, which I think is a lot of where we're talking about is the high-level negotiations here at COP, but where the transition is going to be delivered is state-level building codes for buildings. It's going to be emissions tailpipe standard. It's going to be very detailed regulatory policy that governments are going to produce, and that is where the battle of climate ambition will be fought. And right now we are not winning that, realistically. Trade associations, invested interests have a lot more lobbyists and a lot more lawyers working at that level of detail, which groups like us and the companies we work with can't compete. So I think in terms of how to have impact, it's getting to that level of detail. It's doing the hard grunt work of policy analysis and advocacy at the local level, which will really enable this transition to happen.
On that, thank you. On that, I think there's actually, me talking about NDCs earlier. There's also there's a campaign that's been going on for locally determined NDCs that we're trying to engage with, and essentially, building off of what Dom said, that local ambition, that that very detailed kind of nitty-gritty, boring, planning systems-based change that is key, absolutely, for businesses to engage in, and again to, raise ambition also from the bottom up, so to speak.
Well, so the impactful, I guess, comes back to, it's something I wrestle with as well. While you may have the sustainability teams or the policy teams like on our side working towards this, you have the management teams or the procurement teams internally perhaps not on side. So I guess how can businesses advocate for stronger climate policies while balancing that short-term business interest? There's an example I guess we should use is obviously the American election has made a lot of headlines around the world. Many companies who have science-based targets or have climate targets supported Donald Trump's campaign through the use of PACs, and he's very much an anti-climate kind of thing. So internally, they have mixed messaging going out, and they're campaigning on both sides of this issue. So how do we collectively put our heads together to tackle that? The Nobel Prize will go to the best answer.
That is a very acute issue, which will be very clear over the next 2 years in the US, where particularly US companies with science-based targets who are currently benefiting from the tax credits from the IRA, how they advocate to policymakers in defense of the IRA and the tax credits, and what that has enabled them to do to invest in the clean energy transition will be absolutely crucial for the second largest emitter and the world's largest economy. And so this consistency in how companies lobby is very acute and is being decided in boardrooms in the US right now and will be over the next few years. In terms of the companies that we engage with and what we point to as best practice in terms of how you get this consistency and how a company puts out an ambitious climate policy, the best case usually is go through an internal process between your various teams and your board and create a public policy position on climate. So you have those, whether it's negotiation or sharing of views between different business units internally, and then at the end of it you have a final product that you can put on your website and that you can share with your trade associations, which is helpful, but you've also gone through the internal process and you have that alignment. So now the public affairs, regulatory affairs team and the board are all singing from the same hymn sheet. They've been involved in those meetings, and that now that the company will be more consistent, particularly when they engage their trade group, because that is where so much of this policy advocacy is happening.
The internal alignment piece is really critical, right? People respond to incentives. If you don't have financial incentives that incorporate the cost of carbon, if you don't have, whether it's internal carbon pricing or just fundamentally getting it in the KPIs and performance metrics of people, not just at the top level, but kind of cascading that down through business units and other functions, it's not going to happen, because at the end of the day, we are all humans and we all we have a job to do. And if we're told, if you're in procurement and you've got a great sustainable procurement program, but your CFO says, okay, but ultimately I just want you to go with the cheapest option, it's not going to happen. So that internal piece of alignment is super important for aligning the long-term goal with the short-term business goals. In terms of the actual sort of policy engagement, like you said, at a local level, how are you doing that in the specificity? Maybe you aren't going for the big sort of sexy statement. You're going for that granularity. And then it's the language, right? Most people, maybe they're not motivated by climate as an issue, but they're motivated by jobs, by skills, by diversifying their customer base, by being more competitive or having more resilient supply chains. These are all things that are basic business language that it doesn't need to be sold as climate. We just need to get it done.
I mean, the only thing I'm going to add to this, I think, is, what we call like green literacy or sustainability literacy that needs to be built essentially from the receptionist up to the CEO. And there's various initiatives that work on this, and businesses are very keen to learn, and they do engage with it. It's not, obviously they don't do that massively publicly, because it's essentially, they say like, yeah, we don't know, but there is, I think, a growing awareness within businesses that essentially the CSO knows everything, but it's the only person, in the boardroom that actually advocates for something, and then the CFO is like, oh, actually, no, we don't have money for this. But I think it's changing, albeit maybe too slowly. Just to kind of give you this, what we call like green literacy, trying to like build that up throughout the company. That's really important. And I guess to add to this one last point, I was in a session yesterday about green jobs and how we define what a green job is. It was very much focused on STEM and engineering and the heat pump installers, and that's all very true, and we need those. But I guess a narrative that we're trying to push is like every job is supposed to be a green job. Every job has to have that baseline of a holistic understanding of like how this company contributes to people, nature, and climate, and what the impact of that company is.
And I guess at events like this, we're all campaigners. We all thrive on chaos, and we love this, right? We do see a lot of actions happening, and we see a lot of engagement, lots of letters being sent. Businesses are very risk averse in this space, and they're very slow to move. So sometimes we've seen letters taking 3 to 6 months for a company to sign on and kind of engaging with this. How do you see these two models working together? Is there ways we can kind of bring them up to us, or is there ways that we can maybe slow ourselves down and work on this? How do we square that circle, as they say?
This is slightly the bane of my life, but I think that if there's a balance here, right? You want to be agile and be able to deliver messages that respond to the need in that moment with the urgency of that moment and what leaders need to hear. But at the same time, if you're trying to go through internal legal risk, etc., and you have a CEO who's in a different time zone, you're not going to be getting it in 24 hours. And other than the kind of usual suspect voices that at this point, they've done a fantastic job of raising their voices and are very courageous to have really, as you said, had the consistency to stick with it, and that is very noted. But it's sort of the impact's wearing off if it's always the same people, right? So I think as a community, we also need to think about how do we have a place for different parts of this. And maybe it's that those big statements are, in the moment and responding to an immediate need, and they're never going to be quite the same as the really deep sectoral or national level work that organizations are doing that do take time and that maybe don't get as much profile in the media, but that's kind of the consistent drumbeat that's going on behind the scenes. Yes, but I don't know how to solve the problem, or I would have done it already, but I think it's different messages and different parts of this ecosystem mobilize on this in different ways, and that's fine because people do need to hear it from multiple different places. If you're hearing it from different people in different places at different times, then it might start to resonate.
As an organization which does a lot of corporate sign-on letters, we have some views on that. In terms of kind of success stories of kind of how these big sign-on letters have an impact, a lot of it comes down to a very clear, tangible policy ask, which is at the right political moment. That is kind of where a decision is and can be made. And also you get alignment between the business groups. So this is the one letter that one company is getting from CLG UK, from We Mean Business. The high-level champions are throwing in their support, and other business groups are as well. So you get alignment on the business groups that this is the one message that companies really need to prioritize and to engage and to put through their internal process, and that really kind of means that you have an impact. An impact in terms of getting a company to sign, but ultimately it's about driving policy change, and that means that the relevant minister or head of state, when they have that policy decision in front of them, they have a clear platform of private sector support that this is the right decision that they need to make. In terms of whether or not we kind of need to lower our ambition or bring companies up to our kind of level of policy advocacy, I think it's kind of a meeting in the middle. It's about we need to go and meet them. And a lot of it comes back to kind of upskilling or kind of green literacy, as Viola was saying, in terms of how companies mainstream their climate policy and their climate advocacy. And we produced a responsible policy engagement framework last year, which brought together over 30 tools, examples, and guides for how companies internalize their climate target and come out with a public policy position, how they engage their trade groups, and what are the various different groups and initiatives across our coalition and beyond that can help them do so. So I think if companies go through our framework, and there are other tools out there for companies to do that, ultimately they will be more willing to advocate at the end of it because they'll have bottomed out and understood the role that policy and advocacy can play in terms of how they want to drive their own decarbonisation.
Sorry, I keep sticking to mic here, but yeah, I guess from a very practical angle. So I mean, obviously, so CLG UK is based in the UK, in Cambridge. So you know, we've had a very, I guess our climate has changed in the UK recently, obviously due to the elections. But I guess what I wanted to add is the fact that, you know, there was when I started this job, and it's only been a year, as you know, so far. There was a big letter fatigue. Nobody wanted to sign anything. It really felt stale, and you needed kind of a new momentum. So there's no point in pushing something when that's the case. But I also would like to focus on kind of the first. I mentioned the letter earlier on the UK NDC that we've actually arranged through something called the UK Business Alliance for Net Zero. That's essentially a group that we convene together with Women Business and other Aldersgate Group or other company trade associations and groups. But it's kind of getting that alignment between the groups and then pushing it at the right moment, as Dom said, and then also just identifying first movers and corporate leaders that sign on, because it's a little bit of, it's a chicken and the egg thing. So you have to persuade the leaders to sign on, and if they're big names, it's better because then that gives other people the confidence to sign on too.
Sorry. I think we also just need to get better at the follow-up, because we ask people to sign these letters and it sort of goes into what's often a big sort of black hole of political process, and they don't really know how important it is. So when you actually hear from ministers, governments, whatever, people in the process, or even even at a really technical level, some of these things really do shift the conversations, and as you said, they give them the political cover to know that they can go out with something and it will actually get done. And so the challenge is, it's not A leads to B. It's sort of A and B and C lead to D then E. So it's not as easy to demonstrate how the theory of change is working. But I think we all collectively need to get better at showing where policy advocacy has led to concrete outcomes that have enabled businesses to go further.
I completely agree. Well said. And I guess you've kind of touched on a point that I was thinking as well. The letter signing got stale and people were thinking it's a stale process, it's boring. But policy should be boring a little bit sometimes. Yeah. We should be kind of pushing this forward. But it makes me think of a really great example of this that happened in the UK. It was my first month within WWF, and I was just a runner helping people do some work for a letter that was signed and convened by the Aldersgate Group. So the first net zero debate happened. I think 4 MPs showed up. One of them gave a book review. It was not a very good debate. Civil society got together, campaigned, did a lot of great work, and one of the key messages was the Aldersgate Group letter, where all the businesses were brought together, signed to say that they support net zero, it's good for the economy, it's good for jobs, and it's good for everything in the UK. This was presented to Theresa May, and she says that this letter is the thing that changed her mind. Next net zero debate, full house, it went through the whole process. Theresa May is now the chair of the Aldersgate Group. And that's the power. So yeah, it's boring and we say it like it's old news. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. We can just use boring policy stuff. It's okay.
Another kind of example, and particularly taking up Rebecca's point about the importance of advocacy letters, but then also following up with companies. I'll take the example, the US NDC, when the US rejoined the Paris Agreement, when the Biden administration came in, we worked with particularly our partner series and a few other groups in the US and mobilized over 400 American companies to call for the US to set an NDC of at least 50% emissions reductions. And the president, 1 month after, stood up and did announce that. And he specifically cited the role of the private sector in calling for high ambition. Now that is hugely important, but we followed up with the companies afterwards to highlight what raising their voice meant, and in terms of the halls of power in Washington had heard, but also we then said, now you are enabled to set a science-based target, and subsequently after, I think it was between 600 and 800 US companies set science-based targets in the last 4 years. So we call it the ambition loop, where action by governments can enable companies to decarbonize faster, but equally action by companies, whether it's to decarbonize their own operations or whether it's to purchase electric vehicles, proves the clean energy transition in the real economy and allows policymakers to set more ambitious policies, which then enables further corporate action.
Cool. No, this is fantastic. So I have a specific question for Viola. So you have a background with the German delegation for industry and commerce working in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
This is really interesting. I could spend a whole session asking you about just that alone.
Don't. No, that's not true. I very much enjoyed my time there.
But did that influence your current work? And did you, like, what learnings have you kind of taken from that very specific example into this?
So I mean, first of all, the delegation of German industry and commerce is a liaison office that I don't longer work for, but I've had a very good time with them in DC. So it's a joint office that is supported by the German government, and it's attached to kind of their commercial diplomacy setup, but it's a joint office of the BDI, the German Federation of Industries, and the German Chamber. So the German Chamber is set up very differently. First of all, like every business in Germany has to be a member of the Chamber, so it has actually a big voice and like a very comprehensive voice. But I guess the point being, you know, when I started working for them under the Trump administration, or like while Trump was in office, and was put in charge of something called the German-American Energy and Climate Partnership, which is a tool that the German government has used, not used, but like they've implemented a couple of bilateral partnerships like that. And I guess, what we've learned, or what I've learned in that time is, business has a very strong voice and people listen, but if you want to, you have to change your narrative, and you have to change sometimes the language that you use. So instead, and in a way we were talking about skills way more, we were talking about jobs a lot more, but we were always driving home the idea that, if you go towards 2050 and go towards net zero, like it is an opportunity, and essentially you're going to lose out if you're not doing it. And I guess also say that you have to adjust your language. It's not all lost. There's always people that listen to you, but it is a little harder, and you have to be agile and you have to change your messaging.
And again, these big questions that are circling in my head, which I'm going to steal for my next year's strategy. So thank you all. This has been very helpful. But on this, we see a lot of lobbying. It kind of dominates the narrative as well. And I saw an amazing panel on We Mean Business's Pavilion the other day about this. But I guess, how can we make this more transparent? What's the role of transparency in this whole section? Do you want to jump in?
I'm certainly happy to jump in on that. I think previously, corporate advocacy was mostly done behind closed doors, both by companies and their trade groups. But recently, there have been real progress in this space, really actually led by the investors. CA100 Plus is a combination of some of the world's largest asset managers. They have created a global standard, which they are pushing on the companies that they invest, that companies need to disclose their climate advocacy, and companies are now starting to produce these reports, and Influence Map do a fantastic job of providing analysis of what companies are including in these reports. So we're beginning to kind of lift the veil to understand corporate climate advocacy and how they are engaging their trade groups. This is early days. It's only been for the last few years, and we are about to produce a new piece of work which is looking to kind of platform best practice and what are the key considerations that companies need to include within their climate advocacy disclosure reports. And I think the importance of people who think these reports could be quite kind of dry, or it's just kind of getting into company process. But the important thing about disclosure is that it begins to change companies' processes internally in order for what they produce in the report. So it's not just the final output, it's the internal processes companies have to mainstream their climate target, how they are engaging on climate policy, how they're engaging their trade groups, and that will begin to start to drive change. So it's quite kind of dry and boring, but ultimately climate kind of engagement will need to become that. It can't just be kind of big shiny cops, it needs to be kind of dry policy discussions in trade groups which will ultimately deliver this.
I can't second enough how much actually the value of disclosure is, yes, having the information out there, but the sheer amount of work that has to go on internally, and also the different teams inside a business that need to get involved. But we said earlier, risk, legal, there's a certain amount of the engine within a corporate that gets involved in public disclosures that really elevates this as an issue. And so those companies that have really kind of gone ahead and pioneered this have also seen cost efficiencies. They've realized, wow, we've signed up to this random thing at some point and we're still paying a membership, and those add up. So there's also like tangible business benefits that they get from just doing that inventory. But I think my main point here around transparency is, look, like it's not going to stop. This is going to happen. It's been happening for a long time. And the more you try and gatekeep, the harder it is. The more incentive there is to try and game it and to have sort of things going on that aren't above board. So it's much better, I think, if we just get a base level of transparency and openness that we know this is happening, but on both sides, both the corporate side, but also within politics, where is the money coming from? Within trade associations, right? Like, where is the money coming from? Because then people can make informed decisions about whether, about the interests, whether their interests are being represented. So yes, transparency, fundamentally important, even though, I think most sustainability professionals are a little tired of reporting, but we need to believe that it is a very useful thing to be doing.
I used to refer to myself as a climate change specialist, now I'm just a reporting specialist.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's also about groups like ours, to set to rethink our due diligences, to like be very, to have really reviews, annual reports. It's boring, but it's necessary.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, I guess with all this, I love to keep things practical as well. So for those businesses watching who are going to pick up the mantle and start doing more policy engagement, what great examples have you seen that people can learn from, or that they can kind of look through, that you'd like to highlight? Or there's a lot.
There's a lot, and I've already given one away in terms of the US NDC that we did. I think actually Viola's colleagues in Corporate Leaders Group Europe currently have a live kind of campaign, which I'd love to highlight, and that's for the EU's in the process of deciding its 2040 targets. And CLG Europe have over 100 companies supporting the EU to set an at least 90% 2040 target. So these are many multinationals all across the European Union that are following the lead of science and advocating that the European Union set an at least 90% target, which would be huge, not only for decarbonisation in the European Union, but also that we could use that as a demand signal for climate action globally, that we could then take as part of our advocacy to engage the Indian government, South African government, and many other major economies. So I think that's kind of a live one that we're kind of really happy to support our partner in delivering.
And building on that, I mean, I'm not going to go too far into history, but the UK Corporate Leaders Group, like the Corporate Leaders Groups, as it was called back then, was instrumental in pushing for the 2008 Climate Change Act in the UK. Like, it had the biggest and loudest voice on that one. And I mean, currently, speaking of the back of the campaign that we've just kind of culminated at in the UK with the NDCs, it's not done. We're not finished. It's about the detail. It's about the delivery, and it's about us following up with government and saying, okay, what is actually written in the ICTU, or like in the annex, in the famous annex, and that the private voice is not just listened to, but like that we are actually feeding ambitious voices into that process. And yeah, that's an ongoing thing that we're doing as well.
I guess one COP-related example, last year, I mean, there was a huge mobilization. Sort of, we got halfway through and it was not looking like the fossil fuel phase out was going to get in, and we kind of knew it was the moment it needed to happen. And there was a huge mobilization of many non-state actors, but honestly, I think that I'm maybe biased, but I think that the business voice is very powerful in that non-state actor mobilization to say, to not just demand it, but really offer to the COP president at the time, hey, we're behind you, and it's not the pressure on you, it's the pressure on all the delegates, because you as the COP president can't do it alone. And so that sense of solidarity, I think, is a good way of coming at this, of we are here to help you and enable you. I think that's a good example of how that worked. And then just getting super practical, I do think people should go and look at the We Mean Business responsible policy advocacy framework and resources. There's a lot of really, really specific tools there, as well as the Race to Zero, 5th P, as we call it, Persuade. We work very closely together on all those things, but some really, really tangible, practical pieces around how to get into the detail and start going back in your organization and doing that.
One more, just to, it would be remiss of me not to talk about our Fossil to Clean campaign. And in advance of COP28, it became clear that an outcome on fossil fuels was possible between governments, but we needed to mobilize a private sector voice that was calling for the phase out of fossil fuels. That would add kind of corporate momentum and support and create that demand signal for clean energy technologies. And we got over 200 companies to sign a letter and join our campaign, and ultimately that played a crucial role in the UAE consensus outcome, and particularly the transitioning away from fossil fuel language. And that is a live kind of topic now at this COP, and will continue to be, as that's the type of outcome that we need governments around the world to include in their all-important NDCs and their 2035 targets over the next year.
Sorry, one last one.
I love this. This is great.
This is sorry, guys. So another positive example that I had written down. Again, sorry for being the UK voice here, but Race to Zero. Similar to so kind of hitting into the same curve. But like the sign up of UK businesses was less than 100 pre-Glasgow, and now we're nearly at 6,000. So it's just another example that I wanted to highlight, because it's a positive one, and we need positive examples in this.
Amazing. All right, so I'm feeling a lot more positive then. Fine, you've got me back on side. But I guess, is there anyone in the audience who has a question who'd like to throw to our panels as well? I can go out. We have some there. Anybody with a question? Here we go, up front.
Thanks so much for that engaging panel, very inspiring. Would you say that the policies are in place in terms of companies aligning with the goals of the Paris Agreement? Are they fit for purpose, the policies that we have right now? Or where do you see maybe even some space that companies want to see the bar raised, like in terms of where do they want to see even more rigid policies, or maybe even public assistance, maybe where they even are demanding more ambition?
Sorry, I'll throw in a couple. I mean, there are many, and I know Dominic's going to have a much better answer than me. So, but I'm going to throw in a couple that we don't talk about enough, I think. One is around public procurement and the ability for public procurement to create markets, to really send strong demand signals. We've always talked about private sector having to come in and aggregate demand signals to bring supply on, but actually governments can also do that. And then again, I mean, we talked about it earlier. It's really not sexy stuff, depending on who you are. But permitting and these areas, I think it's not at the moment. The system we have is not necessarily fit for purpose to streamline that. There were all sorts of examples of the lead time it takes to actually get from even getting an FID, like a final investment decision, to actually spades in the ground and physically getting stuff up and running. And you look at what's happened in China in terms of getting massive solar installations up in 14 months, and it is possible. You just need to have the structures in place that allow that.
Yeah. We ran a corporate climate stocktake when we interviewed hundreds of companies in advance of COP28 a year ago, and asked what were the key policies that were barriers right now to companies decarbonising. And the number one thing across all geographies was access to electricity that was clean. So it's access to the grids, it's permitting reform, because just tripling renewables, if we can't get the supply to the major users, whether it's households or whether it's heavy industry or whether it's manufacturing sites, the clean energy transition won't happen. And I'd add one more in terms of a possibility. It's less of a kind of a policy, but it's more kind of around accountability. And I think there needs to be increased focus on how companies and trade groups engage with the COP, and thinking about what could be best practice that we could encourage companies and trade groups to consider in order to attend and to sponsor the COP and its various pavilions, whether that's producing a climate advocacy disclosure report. But I do think further best practice or further standards needs to be raised on this, because I think that will undermine the kind of the hurtful narrative that kind of companies are here just to be lobbyists and it's just about gas deals, which is for some companies, and that deserves to be called out. But loads of companies are here telling their story about how they're decarbonising. So we need to be able to kind of raise standards to lift the floor for how companies engage with the COP.
Yeah, very much agree with that. But I guess what I'd like to add, it's kind of a little bit more high level, but I guess it's something that we've been just begging governments to do, is like obviously raise the ambition, but be consistent, be clear, and stick with it, and be brave, and give to companies that consistency and the investment framework that they can plan, and the planning security, because the wobbling that we've seen recently is just not is really counterproductive. And whether we look at why Europe is currently struggling with their car industry, I mean that's essentially a policy failure that's been it's our own policy failure essentially. It's just be clear, consistent, concise, and stick with it.
Can I just add, we have one particular thing this year that is, a topic of discussion here. And back to your point on grids and transmission, there's a grids and storage pledge and thing going on here. And if we're trying to really get to the point of the, tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency, and I want to point out, if we don't double energy efficiency, we'll need way more than triple the renewables. If we don't have the grids, like my colleague has a very good saying, there's no transition without transmission. And so we really, there's an opportunity here today to really push that as something that we try and get out of this COP as a way to move forward and implement.
Amazing, thank you. Are there any more questions in the audience? Oh, we have another one up front.
Hi, thank you, and congratulations to all those on the panel. And as a company that's signed up to many of those initiatives and those letters, then they are very important, and we value them and value the kind of collective advocacy. My question was around adaptation. We've been talking about mitigation and net zero, and as a company that works, half our business is in the global south, I feel that the adaptation is often ignored, and therefore it seems to be a kind of global north conversation in many respects. But I think it needs to be both clearly, but I think the nexus of adaptation and climate and water and nature isn't as high a profile as it should be as net zero.
I've got the mic, so I'll start. So at the high-level champions launched Race to Zero, as we've mentioned before, at COP26. But COP27 in Egypt really raised that issue, right? We launched the Race to Resilience because it is just as important. And I think there's also going to be a big moment next year for Brazil around, we talk a lot about transitioning away from, but for a lot of countries, this is about green industrialization. It's not shifting. It's how do you build and how do you grow in a different way. And the adaptation piece, I mean, particularly if you're in the food and ag and sort of nature space, it's intertwined, and there are so many solutions that are both. I think that one of the issues of why it doesn't come up as much is also because when we talk about mitigation, there's a very clear language, right? We can measure it. We've all agreed, and the adaptation and resilience conversation is so local. It's so it's difficult to quantify. As the funding has gone up and is going up because we're seeing the impacts all the time. But completely agreed that we sit here and the high-level champions represent all the countries around the world. But those who are able to come to COP aren't necessarily the ones that are representing the reality that is their absolute priority on the ground. So thanks for raising it.
Yeah, likewise. We're a group that primarily focuses our efforts on mitigation, but increasingly our conversation with companies when it comes to decarbonising their supply chains and addressing their Scope 3 emissions. It's an incomplete analysis to only look at how you're going to address your Scope 3 emissions, because at the same time you're doing those kind of stress tests and analysis of your supply chains, you should begin to identify kind of where are key areas of risk that will need kind of investment for adaptation. And that will be done most cost effectively if it's done through a group of companies that are kind of primarily reliant on a single highway for a major export corridor or a single rail link or whatever it might be, and to be done in partnership with the local government. So it's something that we hear consistently from companies, and I think it will be an area which we'll increasingly have to focus our efforts on.
So yeah, I guess what I'd like to add to this is, I mean, from a CISL perspective, you know, we're very much pushing the line. You can't do business on a dead planet, and we're very much working with companies to like also raise their own or like work on their own nature strategies, because a lot of companies don't have that, you know, and especially, yeah, in the UK, but especially globally, obviously. But yeah, it's something that is getting looked at. It's not there yet. We're not. But there's so much work that we still need to do on that part. But it's at least getting recognized as well. I think. From my little experience.
I was hoping you would say it, but actually CISL or corporate leaders groups put out a paper on policy advocacy for adaptation. I think it's the first and only one I've ever seen. So well done for that. And yeah, and absolutely, I think, you know, if it's actually a bit scary when you look at particularly infrastructure investments and things like that, and business decision making on a sort of 10-year business cycle. If you're making decisions now for investments in things that will be online in 7 to 10 years, if you haven't factored in the physical state of the world at this point and the adaptation that's needed, it's wild, right? So I think you're right. There needs to be more of an acknowledgement, and how do we factor it into those decision making up front? But on the policy advocacy space, how do we bring it together? I think they've done, as I said, they've done very well on it on the sort of food and ag side because it's much more obvious how. But on the infrastructure in particular, we released a report last year around what the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda means for business and how business can contribute. And actually, oddly, the infrastructure piece was the one, and water, ones with the least kind of engagement of business, where you would think that it would be blatantly obvious that they need to. So they absolutely need to address that gap.
And we have one last question here.
Okay, so thank you so much for sharing. And I'm a PhD student. I'm from Tsinghua University in China, and my major is in public policy, and I focus on the firm's role in global climate governance. So my question is that, so you mentioned that there are several ways for the companies to engage with public policy making. Do you think that there's maybe another way that, for example, some companies will join some voluntary climate initiatives, especially some public-private partnership initiatives? So do you think it will be an effective way for the companies to get together and then to engage the political process? So this is my question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think a lot of what we've talked about is the kind of the high-level kind of splashy policy advocacy, the big sign-on statements, the big kind of engagement with a minister. But that's appropriate in only certain political contexts, that you can have that direct call from business to policymakers. In other national contexts, that isn't how their kind of functioning and kind of engagement between companies and the government works. Sometimes it's through kind of technical institutes, or sometimes it's through public-private partnerships, and that's how that engagement happens. And it doesn't happen through big splashy sign-on letters. It happens through kind of committee meetings, working groups, and kind of personal dialogue that will change policy, change building codes, whatever it might be. So I take your point that it's in different national contexts and different political systems. Advocacy takes many forms, but all of it for a company, we would consider that companies themselves are their kind of the best understanding of their own advocacy channels that they have with the different governments in their key priority markets, and that they should kind of be evaluating that in terms of how they want to conduct their advocacy.
And we talked about the ambition loop, the whole sort of, you know, business leading, enabling government to go further. In some countries, it's absolutely the other way around, right? And also, I want to acknowledge the role of state-owned enterprise, who I think have been like massively left out of the conversation, other than, you know, there's a focus on national oil companies for a good reason, but there are a lot of state-owned enterprise where, and you know, as I mentioned earlier, public procurement, there's sort of this space where, as we talk about aligning corporate action, ambition, targets, and investment with nationally determined contributions and national plans. I mean, it should be an obvious place to be looking at that level of alignment. And I don't actually know how we've managed to get this far into conversation at COP without saying blended finance. But there's, you know, when you get into the how do you practically work together to do this? It's the finance, but as you say, it's, you know, when you're talking particularly about adaptation and large infrastructure projects, it's going to need to be together fundamentally. When you get to the action, it absolutely needs to be together.
Thanks. I guess another example. I'm the example person here. So, CSL has a global footprint, and, to echo what Dominic said, it's extremely, it really depends on your locality, where you're at. And one of I needed to look that up actually, because it's not my field of expertise, but, we've got a representative in South Africa, and they've, founded the Corporate Affairs Leadership Forum. And it's just another initiative that kind of goes also through more of a university angle, and kind of provides thought leadership. And it's just an example of you have to work with different actors in your different localities and push through there.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I'll go on. One last point.
I'm so sorry. And I just want to shout out, because actually the role of universities is really critical here, because particularly in countries where that relationship between government and the private sector isn't as, isn't going to produce the sort of discussions that you can have in the UK and Europe, as neutral parties that can hold a space of science, of fact, and of neutrality. I think universities and academia in general holds a really important place there. So very good luck on the PhD.
Well, our session is about to end, and obviously these conversations are not. We're going to be here for another week. This is going to be a key thing we're going to be talking about for our whole careers, most likely. And we're moving it forward. But I just want to take this moment to say thank you so much to our amazing panelists. You have won me back around. Businesses can stay. And we're going to move on with everything. So thank you so much.